Morena committee members and those who may be watching from afar, welcome to our second meeting of our Representation Review Subcommittee, and I'll call upon Councillor Epiha to open with a karakia.
Morena koutou, whakataka te hau ki te uri, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atu kura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora. Kia ora.
Thank you. Apologies, I believe we're all here, so there are none. Conflicts of interest, does anyone have any that they need to declare? There are none. And we move on to the confirmation of the minutes. Page is 4 to 7. Moved the Mayor, seconded Councillor Gallagher. Are there any alterations, corrections from anyone? If not, those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, carried. Item number 2. Item 1. Deputy Electoral Officer, consideration of establishing Māori wards or constituencies. Are you leading that, or is Mr. Hill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I just take a moment also, please, to introduce Murray State to members of the committee who haven't already joined us, already met Murray. Murray will be assisting us with some of the details and analysis and understanding of the options that are in front of us as we work through this process. So I'm happy to have Murray with us today. So the report in front of you is a revisiting of the report that was previously presented to the Representation Review Subcommittee on the 19th of August. At that time, the decision of the committee was to allow the report to lie on the table, to come back to the next meeting of the subcommittee, so that it could consider further information in relation to the report and on the consideration of establishing Māori wards, in particular seeking feedback and input from both of the Runanga in the district as to their views on the establishment of Māori ward for the Selwyn district for the next electoral cycle. Those discussions have now been held, and I'll perhaps get the Mayor and Chief Executive to update on those discussions. But there's a brief summary again of the material that was presented last time. In particular, note the discussion around the population numbers, the proportion of members on the, or electors on the Māori electoral roll as opposed to the general electoral roll, and just a restating again of the timeline issues that are facing us in terms of ensuring that this matter is now at a place where we can publicly notify the decision of the council on the matter that's before us. So, Mr. Chair, happy to hand back to you for further discussion.
Yeah, kia ora. I have spoken with and written to both Ngāi Tuhurere and Taumutu, and neither want seats as far as a Māori ward, or the setting up of a Māori ward within Selwyn district. They're interested obviously in continuing discussions as we have had through the district plan review and involvement in that respect, and conversations also talked a little bit about what ECAN has currently gone through around engagement with Māori and lifting participation for Māori. But as far as Māori wards, they're both leaders from both Runanga have said no, they don't want to pursue that at the moment. I wrote to them formally seeking a formal reply and didn't receive anything other than what they'd already told me. So there was no letter back to confirm that, but they have said no. So I'm happy to move A, B, and C that are in the report.
Is there a seconder for the motions? Thank you. Is there any further discussion? There being no further discussion, I'll put those three recommendations as a block. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, carried. Thank you. Item 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item 2 on the agenda is the population representation tables update, which is actually the report at page 36. My apologies that the reports are just in a different order. Page 36 of your agenda papers is the representation tables, and this is just a report for information. This is to provide the updated information on the population data, which we will need to be considering when undertaking our review. And you will see that I have attached on pages 38 and 39 the information that has been supplied by the Local Government Commission late last month, which gives us the updated information in terms of population and representation, both for the ward as a whole, showing a total population of 66,290 in the division among the wards, and also the divisions among the community board and the subdivisions for the community board as well. So that material is there for your information and consideration. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any discussion, members?
It makes certainly interesting reading, and just correct me, am I correct now that these are the numbers that will be used for us to develop possible alternatives or possible options that will go out for submission?
Mr. Chair, through you, there will be an update from Stats NZ early in the new year. So these are provisional numbers, but there will be a further update.
So you're saying that there could be some, well, I was going to use the word minor, I don't know what that's appropriate. There will be some change in those numbers, but
That's correct, yes.
Probably the percentages or the pattern you see there won't change.
You'd expect that would be the case, yes.
Yep, okay.
And I think what they do through you, Mr. Chair, is highlight the significance of the discussion that is going to be ahead of the committee. We've already known where those pressure points were going to be, and it sort of sets our sights on what some of that thinking might be in terms of both representation and also governance numbers.
So I suppose that's all of us. When do we actually get into the nitty-gritties of having that discussion, Mr. Chair?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that I think, Stephen, is the next item on the agenda, really, isn't it, that we're going to be talking about?
Yes, we will need to look at the timeline for the discussion, but essentially we would be anticipating in the new year, perhaps potentially February, March, but we'll discuss that shortly.
So the purpose of today's meeting, John, is basically to deal with the item that we've already dealt with, but subject to timeline, and also secondly just to set the scene for some thinking about the time frame, thinking about the issues, thinking about some of the pre-consultation discussion matters that we might want to bring to our community's attention.
A question I had, John, that you may be able to help with was around pre-consultation around the Malvern Community Board. 6 years ago, the subcommittee went to the Malvern ward to seek feedback on their views of continuing with the community board. There was strong feedback that was desired, and so in the final recommendations to the public, that was part of the recommendation. And so what I'm seeking you as chair of the community board and you and Jenny as representatives of that ward, do you see value in going back in a similar fashion in early consultation around the future of the community board, or do you rather that waited to the full representation consultation?
I can't see any value personally, unless I can understand what the pressure is. Because obviously, if we're asking a pre-consultation, I need to say, well, how many more councils are there? What's the election going to look like? I need to understand what that is before I can make that second part. also another underlying issue. What is council's final decision around committees and structure too? Is also
And to assist with the outcome of that latter part of your comment, John, there's a staff report coming back to council prior to the end of November. I just can't remember the exact date, which will address that governance related matter.
well, I think for you, Chair, it was quite a lengthy discussion with you yesterday and about function, how the working of the commission, how the merits of that, particularly as there was a number of activities for if they understand what's the stage and what's the purpose of the role, structure. Very frustrating. Please just clarify this to my decision.
So if I can repeat my previous comment, that will be addressed by our staff with council no later than the end of November. I guess the supplementary observation is what benefit are those committees giving to elected members, be they community board members or councillors as well. So that will be part of the question that we'll have to discuss.
I guess I'm supporting John in some respects, is that we seem to be sort of ploughing on ahead without answering the fundamental question of the effectiveness of our current representation. Are we, I think, Sam, you've got it on your agenda for a governance review, effectiveness review, ploughing along holus bolus saying let's do a representation review without understanding the effectiveness of what we've got. Having a vision for the future might not be a great way to go. So perhaps the first step is to have a governance effectiveness review and sort of get a vision about, well, what is the vision for this governance group in the future? Is it more? Is it less? Is it the same, or is it status quo? Because clearly that will influence the path you go down here, because there's a number of scenarios around ward-based representation or representation at large. But if you don't start with a effectiveness review and saying, well, actually 11's too much, or 11's not enough, or what is the number, you're struggling to get out of first gear.
Yeah, I think you're right, Grant. So that review of how we operate currently, both ourselves and for the Audit and Risk Committee, is currently being looked at, and hopefully will take place before the end of the year and ahead of our timeframes for the next part of the discussion. The piece for me in this paper is kind of that it just stands out that the status quo is not the answer, or cannot be the answer, cannot legally be the answer. So we're up for change, and I guess to add to what you've said, it's what's our appetite for change, and what's in scope and what's outside. And as far as I'm concerned, everything is up for discussion. And today's about acknowledging that we can't just stay the same as we've always been, because 11 councillors split 2-2-4-3 doesn't meet statutory requirements. So I'm looking forward to February, and it's annoying that we keep having to wait, I suppose, because you get into this subcommittee wanting to actually make some of those decisions and have those numbers, but we don't have it quite yet. So yeah, I'll just have to push pause on that stuff.
Yeah, supporting that, Sam. So I want sort of processes where the people who are directly involved are involved in the review of it. If ever there was a process that wanted independent input, this was it. And I guess that might be you, perhaps. I don't know what your role is here today, but independent assessment of effectiveness would be appropriate, and some sort of advice on that would be helpful.
Yeah, as we commented at the last meeting, some of the order in which we consider things is by statute is actually in practice the wrong order. We decide on the electoral system before we decide on what might be the system that actually works best for us. I'm pleased to see the numbers here to start both ourselves and hopefully our community to consider the future. It is correct. It would be helpful to have some idea of the effectiveness of our governance, whether we need more or fewer councillors and community boards, the whole structure of our representation going forward. But we are unfortunately, due to a time frame that is mandated from central government rather than ourselves, if we have a governance review this calendar year and a feedback early in the next year, that will actually suit our time frame. It will feed back nicely into that. Getting the final figures, population figures, will also help. Like we said earlier, I think they will simply reinforce the trends that we've seen, significant growth in the eastern portion of our district and relatively small growth in the west, which causes the percentage differences and challenges us to find a structure that meets the plus or minus 10%. The plus or minus 10% can be challenged if you have good reasons for doing it. ECAN and their representation review ended up in a situation which, whether they did for the awards, some awards were outside that, and if they had justification for it, can be allowed to differ. It's whether if we went that way, whether we'd have sufficient justification to justify those numbers. So that's any other comments from members or Murray?
I just got a comment, if I may, Mr. Chair. Firstly, I agree with Grant's comments that a good starting point is reviewing your current model and the effectiveness of that model. But equally, I think, as the Mayor has pointed out on page 39, there's some quite telling figures that show that the status quo cannot survive. So one of the other considerations that the subcommittee need to give course to is communities of interest, because there are going to be some quite significant boundary changes required regardless of the number of representatives and how that will be responded to. And looking to the next item on the agenda, I just wonder if we're starting to cross over now into some of the discussion that Stephen's wanting us to have around the process and the timetable.
It's in a very polite way, our frustration in the process, which, and as we circle the carcass, we can't actually get into it and have a bite of it because we know what we want to talk about. But I have not been backward personally in every one of the coffee afternoons that the community board had, and every community committee that I attend, I talk to them about representation review. I've identified to them that it's coming. I've talked to them, and I am very clear in my mind what my community is telling me about communities of interest and things like that, and it comes out loud and clear over and over again. And they pretty much understand the realities of, and without getting too depth into the conversation, because my ward that I really think slightly differently to what I describe as an urban, and they're very clear in the message that they're giving me when it comes to that as to what their expectations are, and particularly around communities of interest and how they're obtained. They're not so concerned and gone, yes, of course the status quo can't remain, but certainly 7 councillors with the remaining wards the same they are, works out quite nicely in the numbers. So if I've crossed the barrier or talked about something I shouldn't talk about, that's fine. I don't really care, quite frankly.
I think foreshadowing the debate we're going to have early next year is not improper. I personally have had a play with the numbers and come up with some different structures that may or may not work, but that's for the committee to consider next year. I think foreshadowing them is not a bad thing, and I'm actually in a way pleased that you've started to raise it with the community, because it's ultimately their decision. And as the Mayor has said, these figures simply show us that our current ward structure with our current number of councillors does not meet the requirements. Something has to change. So that's good to work out. Now, Murray, were you looking to comment? What I'm seeing is a red light blinking behind you. I thought it was from your microphone.
Sorry, Mark, I was just going to make the same point that David made, and that it might be helpful to look at the subsequent agenda item, because there is some discussion on pages 24 and 25 around preliminary consultation, in particular some of the questions that we might take out to the community and ask them to look from a community point of view at the effectiveness of the current representation model.
I want to support John's view, and it's not probably well, this is the place to be blunt. Population is not a great indicator of workload, because especially in Melbourne and Ellesmere particularly, although the population might be disparate, it doesn't have any reflection on the workload generated. And this is the challenge we face. If you use a straight numerical equation here, it doesn't reflect the workload taken to actually service that population. And I suppose if you're thinking of the Banks Peninsula model, where you've got a large geographical area where they've made accommodations for that to make that happen. But in a blunt way, it's easier to service an urban area as a councillor, and that's a generalisation, I know, but it is easier than a large-scale rural community, because the issues are wider, more disparate, and harder to service. So that's just a challenge in front of us.
It is. And it's also a challenge to remember that councillors are elected by ward to represent the district. That sometimes we are stuck in our wards rather than getting out and helping out, help share the load across the district. And that's possibly an outcome of the process, will be that we end up with a different model that will help promote that. Do I have a mover and a seconder for the recommendation for item 2? Mayor and Jenny, you second that motion or recommendation? Yes. That the report be received for information. Those in favour, please say aye. Contrary carried. Item number 3, which we've already been debating, representation timeline and preliminary consultation. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might get Murray to come and join me. He's a part author of this paper. So there are two aspects really to this report. One is to, again, review the timeline. This information has been presented to the subcommittee previously, but it's worth reminding ourselves of what the timeline is. But it's also an opportunity to consider what, if any, preliminary consultation the subcommittee would like the council to engage in as we put that timeline together. So perhaps just to take you through very briefly the timeline issues. We have set out at the bottom of page 21 on your agenda paper. The council must publicly notify its initial proposal for consultation no earlier than the 1st of March and no later than the 8th of September. So there's quite a wide window there, but effectively any time from the beginning of March, we can be in a position to notify our initial proposal, having gone through the process of analysis and proposing a model and a system. And there follows from that the system that you'd be aware of, that public submissions are called. We can make amendments to that proposal. Then we have to give notice to the final proposal. Across on page 22, we need to then forward any appeals to the Local Government Commission no later than 15th of January in 2022, which of course is the year of the election, and a final determination by the 11th of April 2022. And that timeline is again set out on page 22. So under section 3 of the report, the recommended process steps, the guidance from the Local Government Commission is that in setting its timeline, we need to consider whether preliminary consultation needs to be undertaken, and as part of that, identify the communities of interest, determine effective representation for those communities of interest, and consider fairness of representation for electors of constituencies and wards. So very much the issues that you've just been discussing need to be a key part of the early stages of the process. I've noted in section 4, the bottom half of page 23, the timeline that we followed in 2015-2016 was that preliminary consultation was held in July of 2015. The initial proposal and consultation was notified in August of that year. Public hearings and deliberations in October. There were appeals and a petition, and again followed the same kind of timeline with the final decision from the Commission on the 7th of April. So I've made the comment that the Council could follow a similar timeline in 2021, but note that an earlier start would give us greater opportunity for community engagement and consultation, particularly if some preliminary consultation is sought by the subcommittee. For example, that preliminary consultation could commence in the new year and potentially go through to or be during the May-June period once LTP consultation was completed, or could be earlier. That's certainly available to the Council. Section 5 of the report takes us to preliminary consultation and exactly what form that might take. It's again particularly around canvassing those issues that we have been discussing, and there are a number of ways that we might undertake that initial consultation, and using the same sorts of methods that we generally do: surveys, focus groups, consultation documents, workshops in the public meetings, community meetings. These are activities that could be led or facilitated by councillors, community board, or other community groups as well. And some targeted consultation with key stakeholders such as iwi and hapu would also be appropriate during this phase. Some local authorities also consider using independent panels to undertake some of that preliminary consultation, so that's an option that the council may wish to consider. And the Commission also notes that preliminary consultation complements but does not substitute for the formal statutory consultation that's required under legislation. So it is to inform the Council's decision making as it's putting its initial proposal together. And we note there that among the matters that might be canvassed in that preliminary consultation would be the community views on representation options and on communities of interest, and obviously the matters of effective representation. So the balance of the material on page 24 and 25, I may get Murray just to make some comments on this, suggests that one of the key issues, and it's again as you've been discussing, is this whole issue of what are communities of interest and what is effective representation, and that could be a basis for some discussion. And we've noted on page 25 some of the questions that could be asked as part of that pre-consultation, things like asking people, do they know what ward they belong to? How satisfied are you with council's current representation? How does that community feel that councillors should be elected? What kind of relationships do they have with the community in the wards in which they live, or with other parts of the district, or with areas outside the district? And even investigating things like where people routinely work and live and shop and recreate, and all of those issues help us to gain an understanding of what those communities of interest are all about. And membership and participation in organisations, clubs, sports, activities, all of those kinds of things also help to build up a picture of what communities of interest look like. We've set out some commentary on some of the options around the ward system versus the mixed system, which is partly elected by ward and partly elected at large. Again, just matter for consideration as part of the thinking in that early stages. So one of the recommendations then clearly is to look at whether we wish to undertake community consultation, preliminary consultation, and what the timeline for that might be. Murray, do you want to make any comments about some of those matters?
Yeah, perhaps just briefly, thank you. One of the matters that you see from the Commission when they do look at what the councils do is what sort of feedback do they get from their community, and how do they actually form their initial proposal. So the idea of the pre-consultation is to enable you to have an understanding of where your community is coming from. In fact, it was heartening to hear there's actually that conversation's happening already. But I suppose you've got a changing community, and it's understanding where they eventually will come from. And that's what the Commission would like to know about. So while that's not the final decision, it's important to understand where that is coming from. So that's what the basis of this is about, is to find out what the community is thinking.
Thanks, Barry.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think some pre-consultation would be really good. And actually, I feel like we should be diving into the conversation we've all been holding off on a little bit sooner, like today, rather than next year, around what this might look like. Because there's a couple of bits in here, particularly around 9.10. Local authorities need to consider the council size. And I think council size has a massive impact on representation, because council size determines the amount of remuneration available for people, which then determines whether or not someone is willing to put their hand up for election. It doesn't necessarily change the makeup of council at the end of the day, because it's up to the votes and the voters. But the range of people that are willing to put their hand up is limited if the pool of money is limited. And if you're at the moment, we're at about 40,000. Just above $40,000 per councillor. That means those that can afford that put their hand up, and those that can't afford that don't put their hand up. If we had less councillors, the pool of money remains the same and is split between less people. If it's 50,000, all of a sudden there's a whole range of people that for them and their families, that is enough for them to make the decision that they can give up what they're doing or cut down on what they're doing and stand for election. So I think from a representation of who puts their hands up, I think at election time it would be a good thing to consider the council size. And if I think about two examples on each side of us, council size in Christchurch is 16. Council size in Ashburton has just dropped from 11 down to 9. Feedback from Ashburton councillors who are there now are loving the way that the council is able to work together with 9 members rather than the conversation that they used to have under 11, and that's not just about personalities around the table. It's easier to have conversations with slightly less people in 9 rather than 11. And you get to Christchurch and you start thinking, well, there's 16 elected people. How on earth do you come to a space to be able to determine an outcome, particularly when each ward is represented by one person who's then fighting and battling for their ward particularly? I don't think that's I think less is better than more. And if we think about boards and governance structure, and that same point goes on to the need for efficient and effective governance for the district, we've currently got SICON, one of our boards operating with 4 members, is its decision-making body as directors. We've previously had 5. I'm not suggesting we go that low, but a board of between 7 and 9, or a council of between 7 and 9, I think would be a healthy outcome, as providing a balance of remuneration options for a wider portion of our district to put their hand up, and then also for a better and effective decision making in a timely way. I think that could be helpful as well. So to do that, I can only really see 3 options, and so actually asking our community out of some options around plus or minus 10% how that's going to work out. There's election at large, which means you don't have to worry about the plus or minus 10%. I don't think that's going to be particularly palatable for the community, but I think the opportunity for them to know there is an option there. And then you have a Rolleston plus everyone else, which again, I'm not sure. It would be interesting to know what the feedback would look like if it was there. And then you have another option, which is Rolleston plus a number of other wards, whatever happens outside there. You could split up Rolleston, but then you start splitting up communities of interest. So I think to put something to the community that has some basic outlines of what change could look like, not necessarily putting lines on a map, but maybe just putting blended colours or something on a map that shows where areas could be, would just be a good heads up for the community to start thinking about change. Change is coming. What sort of change would you like to see? What outcome would you like to land on? And the feedback from that, I think, could be quite helpful for us next year as we think where we go. We've done pre-consultation for area plans, we've done it for a district plan, and I think the more times you're able to ask someone and then shape where we get to as an iterative process rather than a hard and fast black line that then has to be challenged, could be good for us. One of the other questions to ask might be how many kilometres a year do you travel in your vehicle, as an example, to find out how far from home people actually do roam, because more and more I think people are more connected, whether it's between ourselves and Christchurch across the border or whether it's inside Selwyn, actually the facilities that they want to engage with, the clubs that they want to be a part of, family members that live across the district, are more and more across the current ward structure. So yeah, I support going out and doing something. So
some of the questions that 6 years ago the committee considered were the minimum number of councillors per ward, because that can also make a difference. I think our neighbours in Christchurch have bought themselves a pile of trouble by having 16 wards each with an individual councillor. It makes it difficult for both the councillors and the residents. A number of wards, a Ralston-only ward, which would be an urban ward versus the more rural rest of the district, is an interesting question. But I just wonder if we have the time, just an initial discussion on what are our communities of interest. Because I have found since we brought in district-wide rating for a number of our structures, that's lowered the barriers of parochialism that we used to have. The people are starting to think more district-wide and less township and ward structured. So that's brought in, I think, a slightly broader community of interest. People see themselves as belonging to Selwyn rather than Selwyn Central Ward or Springs, Ellesmere, Malvern. And so that's helped soften those boundaries. So perhaps we just, as members, we can all just indicate what we think the term communities of interest mean, and for where we represent, do we see that as how do we see that?
I have concerns about comparing what a councillor will get paid in regards to the representation that our communities are going to have. And probably because I'm from Melbourne, if you're going to cut back on councillors up there, we're just going to be out in the Neverland and not get the support. I've got my views on councillors at large too, because of the situation that we're in, and also decisions that are made are going to, like John said, we can't make decisions until we know the numbers that we've got as to whether we've still got a community board. So it's really hard at this stage, to give I've got a whole lot of mixed views at the moment.
Yeah, I agree a little bit with Jenny, and I think John's raised some good points there around understanding what we're coming up against, what we're going to have to deal with in the future, to understand where the local aspect comes into it. I guess what I'm afraid of at large is that we lose that local connection to the people that we've originally been elected to. I see the advantages in at large. If we're talking about a Selwyn as a district-wide rating, we're a district rather than wards. I see the advantage in that as well. So I think the debate needs to be had. We need clearer information moving forward, but be mindful of the fact that we do not want to lose the local constituencies' feelings. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Well, it's pretty simple for me, really. And this is how I see it. If you use the number of 66,290, or give or take a few, you start with 7 councillors, you get an average of about 9,470. You have 1 in Melbourne, 3 in Selwyn Central, 1 in Ellesmere, 2 in Springs. You don't change the ward boundaries that much. You have communities of interest, and my community will fight for community interest. One councillor, if he's got any balls and any ability, will have no problem serving the community if you change the community committee structures. have residence committees, and the council staff and process does its job properly by going into those communities as 3 times a year and presenting to the community leading up to those significant times of prior to the annual plan, district plan. So to me, that covers community of interest. The person lives in the ward and is connected, and you don't change too much. And that's where I come from. And that's what my community is telling me. And there'll be no community board.
First thing is I think we should upskill ourselves a bit. We know about wards, we don't know about at large, we don't know about mixed system. So there's 12 that are at large and 4 with mixed systems. So I suggest we either have a visit or a Zoom meeting with those constituencies and find out how does it work? How does it play out in those places? Let's hear from them, the challenges or the opportunities that they hear. Let's articulate the fear about at large. The fear is that you'd have 7 councillors all from Ralston, for instance, or the reverse could be 5 from Darfield, for instance, because of the voting nature of the rural communities. So that's the fear, isn't it? That is not representative of our community. So you need to acknowledge that, talk about it. As much as we're passionate about council, the average person on the street is not engaged with what happens at council. To be honest, let's be honest with ourselves. You go out and have consultation, they're likely to want to use it as an opportunity to have a smackdown. What option is going to reduce my rates? Which, without actually functionally understanding what it is we're trying to actually tell them about representation. So I think that any consultation we do must be couched in the terms of what's in it for me, which is the mantra which most of our ratepayers operate under. What's in it for me? They're not really interested about us as people. They want representation, which is particularly they want their rates to remain stable or still, but they want someone or people that represent them in a dynamic manner and represent their views. I suppose I should challenge Sam's view of the world, and I don't regard the pay as a driving factor for people to stand for council. I think that it's still the last bastion of public service where you stand because you believe you can make a contribution to your community and you want to make a difference. And I think it would be unfortunate if we got in a position where we employ people because it's a job, which would, I think, may attract the wrong type of candidate. And that's a personal view, but it's not. So there needs to be some rationality in our decision-making process for our ratepayers. If we go out and just and Stephen asked the question, how do you feel about representation? You're not going to get a very good answer. I think some development of options around what this might look like, and John's just given you a very good one, option 1. As Sam said, it doesn't appear that the status quo is achievable. So why don't we develop 3 or 4 strategic options which we can go out and actually talk to our community about? I think as a committee here, we should be getting off our bottoms and actually going out in the community and whether it's at public events or markets or wherever it is, putting the tent up and actually trying to explain to our ratepayers what this actually means in reality, what it might mean in the future, and how it's going to either benefit them or not. Because at the moment, most people value the ability to pick up a phone and have someone who lives 10 minutes down the road or 15 minutes down the road perhaps pop down and see their particular issue. They're not used to the concept of digital representation or that type of thing yet, but it's the future, I guess, where you are represented on a more distant platform. So
I guess the idea around communities of interest is they're just bigger than they ever used to be, because our travel and connection is bigger than it's ever used to be. So yeah, I'm interested to see what the community would feedback to us, like going to sit around just some basic ideas and then feedback, and if a couple of them can be thrown out, that's really going to help next year when we go back to them and ask what do you think of this preferred option.
I guess that's the challenge for us, and I was talking to Murray earlier on about this. What we always experience here, and this is the skill of being a councillor or a governor, is understanding the feedback you get about whether it's widespread. And, I used the swimming pool as a classic example. The noise you heard about that, you would have thought we didn't even need a swimming hole. Whereas in reality, once it was built, everyone said, well, we thought it was just a no-brainer, and why didn't you build it bigger? So I am wary of us attracting a subset of our community which doesn't really reflect our community.
So one of the other things that we're going to separate is the process for engagement and the process for decision making. So Stephen asked an innocuous question earlier on. He said if we asked back what ward they belong to, would they be able to answer the question? So for me, the question that I always come up with is, do constituents relate to their electoral ward, or do they relate to council as a whole? Because decision making is only made by council of the whole, not by representatives of a particular ward. The flip side that we've got to balance has been clearly articulated is that two of our wards have quite traditional thinking, Ellesmere and Melbourne, and the others largely the population has arrived in the last 10 to 15 years. So don't have that traditional thing. We introduced district-wide rates successively over the past 4 years, and you'd go a long way to find somebody that's been disadvantaged as a result of that. You know, bigger pools of money, bigger investment that we're making in there. So for me, it comes back to the central decision-making body of council that everyone needs to relate to.
Thank you. That was a really useful and interesting discussion. I think we agreed that preliminary consultation is a good idea. We didn't touch on potential time frame for next year, but I guess that can come back, potentially come back for our December meeting in terms of there are pros and cons. Do we go out? Would we be able to go out in March prior to the LTP consultation, or do we wait till after April when the LTP consultation is finished? Either time frame I think works, given that we need to make a decision. I would personally support either of those two options. I'm just not sure which works best in the grander scheme of things, with where we're having further submissions on the long-term plan, on the district plan, the LTP with a early consultation on the LTP is important. Just where we sit with that. I think between our December meeting and our February meeting, we have the ability to come back with some different potential ward structures. As I said earlier, I've played with the numbers and come up with some different potential structures ranging between 7 and 13 councillors, which makes the numbers work. And I haven't, I'm not pushing any particular barrow on those because they're just the numbers. I travel across the district and meet people from a wide range of the district, and sometimes they come back to me with issues and not to their ward councillors because it's the councillor you know, not the councillor of your ward. So that actually indicates that sometimes it's how well the councillor is known, how well the councillor is seen in the district rather than what ward they are from. So I guess where are we going from here? Are we going to agree, looking at the recommendations in front of us, that B, to set an indicative timetable? Do we need to set the preliminary consultation time frame today, or do we agree that we think preliminary consultation is a good idea and we set the time frame at our next meeting? Mr. Hill may respond to that.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. It would be, I guess, helpful to have an indicative timeline, or to know what the span of those different steps would look like. We do need to start, obviously we can adjust those, but the earlier we can start to lock subcommittee meetings in, the better, and also to give us time to plan that preliminary consultation and think about what would be the options to include would be helpful.
Mr. Chair, did I just ask where we ended up with the first report? Should we on Māori wards? Yeah. So A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And on the second part of the report, the Representation Review Subcommittee recommends to Council to resolve that no Māori wards be established, but that we considers further information in relation to the report on the consideration of establishing Māori wards or constituencies. Or was that? So I'm sorry, and should have prepared myself better, but after 6 years, we've skipped through that pretty quickly, so it went straight over my head. I'm just understanding that with all the training that I've had this year as a governor, we've got two hapu that are not in this room that have given their verbal report that don't want Māori wards. I accept that. I feel that there should be a formal recognition of that in writing, at least representation. I find it difficult for me to make a decision on that when, and possibly I already have, but not having the parties in the room, I don't see that as good governance. So governor to governor, I feel that there should be at least some written documentation supporting their position.
I just remind the meeting that we opened it with discussion on this report, that the Mayor gave, articulated, should I say, the outcome of discussions that he had with the respective iwi. Other questions were asked for. There were none, and we put the vote, and there were no dissenting voices.
And I think there still is the opportunity, Shane, if there was a will of the community to have that, as was indicated in the timelines, to have a poll on this issue. But it's hard to go to the Runanga and say, you must reply to us in writing. They've given the verbal indications to the Mayor, which is the indication that they did not support the creation of Māori wards. And I have no indication that that's not an appropriate response. And we have addressed this in this recommendation. So I guess for me, we've done what we said last time. We've gone back at the previous meeting. We said we'd go back and further consult. We've got that confirmation from them. We've passed this recommendation, and now we're on to the third report, looking at the time frame of the representation review. I guess one of the questions I'd like to see members, do we support, which of a pre-consultation, March or May, to give Stephen an indication of time. A question to you, Stephen, is at what time in February are we going to be able to consider these the numbers, or do we go out to this pre-consultation with the numbers we have in front of us today, assuming that there's not going to be a dramatic change in the update?
I would expect that we'd be able to do some analysis on the numbers, fairly early in February. They will be available, as we've discussed. There's not likely to be a significant shift from the numbers that we're currently seeing, and we could probably bring those back to the subcommittee in early February for framing some options for consultation.
Meeting round the first council meeting in February, it would be your expectation?
Yes.
Will we have achieved the governance review and had time to look at the two other systems that are in place at other councils before that? I mean, I'm happy to support the timeline, no problem with that, but just as long as we achieve do the groundwork before we start going out to those pre-consultations, because that's the first question someone's going to ask you. How's it going at the moment? Unless you do that governance review, you got an answer.
Yeah, plan would be to have that governance review done prior to Christmas.
I'm not sure how we achieve the discussion with councils that are elected both at large and or with a mixed at large and ward system. That's unclear on how we effectively address that between now and our December meeting.
I'm sorry, I'd have to do some research onto that.
I mean, I'm happy to, when we know where these places are, I'm happy to talk to the mayors of those places or the chief executives and get them to have a Zoom call with us and we can ask, perhaps if we can think about the questions we'd like to ask, and they can be pre-warned about what we'd like to have a discussion on, set the agenda, and then that can happen quite simply.
If they transition,
Can you use?
if they'd transitioned relatively recently, we'd get some really good feedback from the governors and the staff about the challenges and opportunities and how is this a disaster, or has it actually worked brilliantly, or is there a midway point somewhere?
And through you, Mr. Chair, grant to you, I think, given the relationships that we've got with councils, that would be reasonably easy to satisfy within a short period of time.
And I guess for me personally, I'd like to see rather than just a little bit broader than the Mayor and Chief Executive, because their view may not be, I'd like to hear perhaps from a councillor or two in the coalface. You know, a really good councillor would be one who's been on that council when it was by ward, and if they've changed to at large, how well that transition has worked and appears to be working for their community, or in a councillor from a district where they use a mixed system, just to understand a little bit broader. With no disrespect to you, David or Sam, sometimes the Mayor and Chief Executives, you may not be quite the view of the other councillors around the table. So, but if we can organise this, if we can organise this over the next month or so, and if we have to call a Zoom meeting for members and do so that we can get that understanding of how well the system does or does not work elsewhere, can be helpful. What's Ashburton use a mix? They've got an urban ward in the rest of the district, which is kind of that model. It's a little bit what you touched on earlier, Sam, of a Ralston ward and the rest of the district. Because I'd be interested to hear how well that works, setting what is essentially an urban ward against the rural wards. It does seem to be potentially fraught with problems. So, David.
So I was going to say, is when's the next meeting of this committee?
The 9th of December.
So it's basically,
2 months.
yeah, the answer to your question, Grant, therefore, is we're going to do it between now and the 9th of December, or a week before the 9th of December. Is that achievable, Stephen?
I think so, yep.
Yeah.
It will depend on the availability of those other councils, but
Sure.
Getting back to the question of pre-consultation, if the numbers are available and we can make a suitable recommendations or at least proposals at our February meeting, would the members be happy with pre-consultation in March, or would you prefer to wait to May?
So you're saying March?
Yes.
So just, yeah, March would be before we go out with LTP, won't it? So that would actually work if we were to do early March. Because when's Easter next year?
It's early.
Hey?
It's early next year.
Really?
My thought around the consultation time is we're asking a lot of our communities all the time, and could this not just be another question that's a part of the LTP? Yeah, so when we're having engagement sessions, it's in the same engagement session, we can just ask another question rather than going twice and asking people to turn up twice or answer twice or fill out twice. Or
it's certainly an option. I guess I'm cautious generally about mixing different types of consultation, and one of these is about representation, the other one is about budget and work programs, and people are in a mindset around the LTP about budgets and work programs and projects. It's a somewhat different focus, and given the wide-ranging issues that we've discussed, I'm not sure that one question would be sufficient to adequately canvass the representation issues.
And Mr. Chair, I'm in Stephen's camp as well, and I think that we do have opportunities to go out with representation review consultation early March through early April, because we won't be going out with the LTP until post-Easter.
Yeah, I think if we look at page 25, the range of questions that pose there that could be asked, I think that would be difficult to ask those sorts of questions and LTP questions in the same consultation event without scoring the scrum for one or the other, because people might misunderstand it and get the opinion that if you reduce the number of councillors, you reduce the amount of rates needed to fund those councillors, but that's not how the system works. And so I personally prefer we keep the consultation separate and clear rather than muddying the waters for either. So are we agreed then that if possible, a March pre-consultation?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd challenge the view around separating them on is most people just see this as council asking a question, whether it's about a town centre or a district plan or a long-term plan or Greater Christchurch 2050 or a representation review. It's just council asking me another question. They're not necessarily getting down to the defined of engagement in this, but I'm not interested in that next piece. So I understand what you're saying, and maybe it does need its own space, but I don't think that's because it's a completely different topic. Because as Grant has already said, most people group us together, have a view about council, and when we ask them a question, they just switch their council brain on.
Okay. Do we need to include the indication that March is our preference in these recommendations, or is that understood and we can pass recommendations as stand in front of us?
I would assume, Mr. Chair, that one of the papers that comes back for the 9th of December meeting will actually have that detailed in terms of the time frame of going out, closing, evaluating, etc.
Thank you. In which case, do we have a mover and a seconder for those recommendations in front of us? Moved the Mayor, seconded John Morton. Any further debate? If not, those in favour please say aye. Contrary, carried. Our next meeting is the 9th of December. The time of 8:30 is unlikely to change because we have an LTP workshop to follow. So, but members should feel free to both take these numbers that were in the reports today out to the community, and also if they have some thoughts about a potential structure going forward, sending them through to Stephen, because all that can feed back into the December meeting of what we may or may not discuss in a preliminary leading into February. There being no further debate? Yes.
For our next meeting, and particularly once we get the real numbers, is there an interactive app or program where we can type in desired number of councillors, total population, and it'll spit out, it'll make sure we get to plus or minus 10%, or tell us what plus or minus 10% or wherever we sit with that, and is map based that you can draw lines on and the calculations done for us, so that we can sit in a meeting here and say, if the line goes down this road, this is what the numbers look like. If we move that line 3 k's that way and include that little town, now the numbers move like this. Because if we could have that or develop that, it would just speed up the conversation and mean that we could talk about multiple scenarios really quickly, rather than taking weeks between needing to draw different maps and come up with different calculations.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of any tool that gives us that capability to do that on the fly. That's we could certainly have a spreadsheet that's up and live and play around with the numbers on a spreadsheet basis, but I'm not aware of anything that gives us that capability. I can make inquiries through the local government commission, but see if they're aware of anything.
It's the mesh block structure, Sam, that doesn't really make it's a little difficult for that. If you look at the map of mesh blocks, the urban ones are rather large and oddly shaped. So you can't just draw a line down a road and say left and right of the road, because the mesh block may go some considerable distance either side of the road. When we looked at options in the last representation review, the rural mesh blocks are large and have generally very few people living in each of them. So shifting what appears to be a very large geographical area can make very small difference. And as it turned out, we managed to make the 4-ward structure balanced by shifting Burnham Camp and its environs from central to Ellesmere. And that was because the camp itself was quite a large mesh block, from memory, 1,500 or so residents, whereas the neighbouring rural mesh blocks had way smaller.
Can I ask then, is there the ability to have the mesh blocks set out, or the numbers from the mesh blocks set out, even if it's just on an Excel spreadsheet, that looks something like our geography, so that even if we move what's highlighted within the spreadsheet, we can get a feel for where wards may or may not sit. So I understand it's not necessarily going to be by exact road, but if it was set up so that Selwyn, your mesh block data was on an Excel spreadsheet that looked like Selwyn, then we could highlight or de-highlight particular cells to understand the numbers. I just like something that we were able to play with and debate and talk and challenge, and then be able to see what the outcome is in the meeting or in a workshop, rather than needing to waste lots of time.
So, Mr. Chair, happy to have a look at that option. We'd need to talk to our GIS team and load that data into GIS and see what capability we can do, but it might be an option.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Look, I just wanted to, I guess, explain a little bit of myself for my comments earlier. Mana whenua have decided they would not like representation of Māori wards. I've agreed to that. I'm tangata whenua. I respect mana whenua authority. So by agreeing to that, I respect their authority. We've heard from mana whenua. We haven't heard from tangata whenua. So I believe there should at least be a poll to find out and reflect our communities. Our annual report, page 4, has got that we, Council recognises the obligation to take into account Māori views. There's more Māori view than just mana whenua, and I respect mana whenua. I'm tangata whenua. That was the point that I was trying to make, and I agree. I just think more consideration is needed moving forward. I'd also like to raise the fact that today is significant in another couple of accounts. He whakaputanga was signed today, 1835, and that was the Declaration of Independence between two people. Also, today has been chosen as a commemoration for the New Zealand Wars, where our men from both sides, totaling 40,000, lost their lives. So I would just like to acknowledge that today, and acknowledge the fact that we're a district different from where we were 6 years ago. It's reflective in our council, it's reflective in the landscape, and it's reflective in our people. And we need to be engaged in that regularly. And we do that through our councillors, we do that through our social media, we do that through our people. One last thing from me, whatungaru te tangata toitu te whenua. As the people disappear from sight, the land remains. What we do now remains. So kia ora koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora.
Any other comments, discussion from members? Grant.
Well, the obvious answer is community consultations. When we're out there, we ask the question, and that, and we'll soon see whether tangata whenua has got a voice that you believe is we'll get some feedback for that, I would imagine.
Yeah.
That's the obvious answer.
I agree. That would be the appropriate time. We'll be framing up the questions early in the new year, Shane. So that's possibly one of those questions that we put out there.
Thank you. Members, did you want to close with a karakia, Shane, or Sam?
Karakia whakamutunga. Unihia, unihia, unihia. Unihia ke te uri tapu nui. Kia wātea, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, me te wairua i te ara tangata. Ko ia rā i rongo, whakairia ake ki runga. Tuturu whakamaua, kia tina, teina. Humie, huie, taekie.
Thank you, members. Our next meeting is December 9th with a possible Zoom meeting before then to discuss with other districts how their representation works. Thank you, and we'll see you this afternoon.